Well, I'm Brigadier Ben Barry. I'm the land warfare expert at another London think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And it was a great privilege to be invited by them and 16 Brigade to chair this meeting. And in a moment, I'll hand over to Brigadier Colin Weir. I've just got something to say about air assault and my own sort of adaptability and learning experience. I actually had the privilege of being a regimental officer in a light infantry battalion that was put into 6 Air Mobile Brigade brackets trial, one of the 2 experimental brigades the British Army formed in the last century, and a story that perhaps might be worth unearthing. The brigade initially was based on 27 Luftlanding Brigade, which was an air mobile corps reserve for the 1st German Corps. And actually it had modelled itself on that and done its initial learning and its initial trials based on the 27 Luftlanding Brigade model. But One Ally came in also with a new commanding officer about a year afterwards. Commanding officer, straightforward, conventional light infantryman, but he'd been chief of staff of a brigade that had had 2 para it. And he said, Ben, actually, I take all the learning from the Luftlanding Brigade, but actually there's a hell of a lot of learning we could also do from the Parachute Regiment and 5 Airborne Brigade. And part of that is the employment of an air adjutant to basically be the air mounter, the air mover, and the sort of commanding the team that helped deliver that. And he said, you're it. There isn't time to go on a course, but let's have a couple of beers and I'll tell you how it works. And that for me was a fantastic learning experience, which was reinforced by putting a parachute regiment officer, Hamish Fletcher, into the brigade as chief of staff, and he certainly simplified things and made them and brought those 2 streams together to develop what for the British Army was really something quite new. The role then no longer became trial, it was turned into 24 Brigade, and then 24 Brigade was fused with 5 Airborne Brigade to become 16 Air Assault. So you get 2 streams of British military capability and capability development going into one. I would also say that as a staff officer in military operations in the late 80s, I had policy responsibility for 5 Airborne Brigade, and actually I got to know them quite well and learned a hell of a lot from them, much of which, surprisingly, was very relevant to energising and getting new approaches in what was an armoured infantry battalion that I actually had the privilege to command. So what I'm really saying is I'm hugely grateful for those experiences and to the Parachute Regiment and 5 Airborne Brigade as a precursor of those. I think it's also safe to say that 16 Brigade, who did more than their share of heavy lifting in Helmand Province, were lucky compared to some of the heavy brigades because they got taken off the Afghan cycle beforehand and were therefore slightly ahead of the 3rd Division in rebuilding expeditionary capability. And I think, boy, have they been doing that, and they've been doing that in a serious multinational context with the French and US airborne forces. And the commander has very kindly agreed to come along and share those experiences with them, to which I'm looking forward.
Ben, thanks, and thanks for the introduction, which was spot on. So thanks to you. We're really grateful as well to RUSI for giving us the opportunity to tag on to the Land Warfare Conference and to offer those of you who have chosen to remain an update on the development of airborne interoperability with the 2 major allies that we've heard quite a lot about over the last couple of days. So the Americans in the form of 82nd Airborne and the French in the form of 11 Parachute Brigade. And what you're going to hear from me for the next sort of 20-25 minutes with a bit of video thrown in is it is fight tonight business. It is tactics. It is not blue sky thinking. And there's been a lot of blue sky thinking over the last couple of days. What we are about is delivering capability in a fight tonight context. And we're also, incidentally, about bringing air manoeuvre back into the centre of the Army's consciousness. It having, I think, in part through the effect of the last 15 years campaigning, sort of slipped off to a flank slightly. If there's a headline really to take away It's that airborne interoperability is delivering a capability. It's delivering a capability. This is not about notions or aspirations or totems. They're capabilities that currently exist and have been proven in the field over the last 3 to 4 years. And while we remain cognizant of the political utility of allies in generating a breadth and a depth of legitimacy for an intervention as military people and essentially as a military tactical level commander, we're in the business of delivering capability that can achieve tactical level or operational level military success. But with an eye on the strategic, Allied airborne forces offer compelling options today for decision makers in London, Washington or Paris in a future that's likely to include a myriad of extraordinary, rapidly emerging and unpredictable threats, in addition to some predictable threats to which the sort of capability that we offer can apply. In terms of the scope, you've probably seen the flyer in the delegate pack written by John Clark. Over the next 20 minutes, as I say, these are the things that we are going to touch on. Essentially, I'm going to explain to you in a bit of detail what 16 Brigade have been asked to do, what we've achieved, and what comes next, sort of pushing into the fight tomorrow space. So why are we taking the opportunity to brief you on this today? Well, really, it's because this conference sits neatly at the back end of an exercise that you may have been tracking called Anaconda. And our part in that was Exercise Swift Response, which was the culmination of some 8 months of work, or depending on your aperture, perhaps 4 years of work, bringing a number of separate and mandated UK resourced exercises and subsuming them into one large multinational exercise, which in itself is very efficient in terms of time and resource. The model that we moved to with Exercise Anaconda Swift Response gave us the benefits of economy of scale that accrued from working alongside our airborne allies and in the context of a wider allied air, maritime and land demonstration of capability, especially with the joint forcible entry into Poland. And during that broader exercise, we conducted 2 joint forcible entry operations into 2 countries. We conducted 2 separate FTXs, and we conducted a command post exercise under the 82nd Airborne. And this video will give you a flavour both of Swift Response 16, which is just concluded, but also of an exercise called Eagles Amarant, tagged as Pegasus Amarant, which happened last October, and which focused on our relationship with the 11th Parachute Brigade. Sorry.
The opening set-piece event is a mass parachute drop over the Polish plains.
You know, the airdrop might be American and British and Polish, but the audience is global. Hundreds of journalists here, certainly representing every European country. There is no way Vladimir Putin will miss this.
From here, the soldiers will split and march to various points to capture bridges and cross rivers. This is a very deliberate show of strength to a country that right now is enemy number one to NATO and is only a few hundred miles away from here.
Across Norfolk, a scattering of paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, float to the ground near Thetford. The latest mission, part of 2 weeks of intense training by British and French paratroopers working together as one unit.
We're practicing scenarios where we go into a country that's been destabilised through internal conflict. We are practicing with working with the French to sort out our common procedures, get used to the language barriers, the planning differences and the equipment differences as well.
The Colchester-based 16 Air Assault Brigade and from France the 11th Brigade Parachutiste are each Army's rapid reaction forces, but for the last few years they've been teaming up regularly to train, putting them at the forefront of Franco-British military cooperation.
We might be deployed together anytime, we know that. I think airborne troops are specifically dedicated to emergency action, so that's the reason why we prepare together along the year. Quite frankly, it's a really best opportunity for us to improve and to be prepared to deploy together.
So I hope that gives you a flavour of the kind of activities that we've been undertaking and the depth to which we are integrated with our allies. Lifting it up slightly to the more strategic, multinational interoperability and cooperation are fundamental, I think, to the generation of capability for future operations. And as G.K. Chesterton suggested on the initial slide that I showed you, I think they're equally fundamental to the legitimacy and certainly the endurance of any intervention. Clearly, the UK's preeminent defence relationship is with the United States, closely followed by France, with the latter's comparable force size and composition to ours. And while our armies develop mutual interoperability within NATO and ABCA, our airborne forces, again a subset of all of that, share unique levels of bilateral ambition in readiness, capability, collaboration, and also the alignment of future strategy and concepts. And I think key to this is that the bilateral engagement between the UK and France and the UK and the US is underpinned by codified strategic bilateral agreements. And the most recent UK SDSR also made a commitment to for UK defence to be international by design by developing stronger combined military formations and capabilities and the further development of capabilities in depth. But looking first of all at the US underpinning of our relationship is in the form of the US-UK bilateral vision statement signed by the CGS and the Chief of Staff of the US Army. And that was signed in March 2013, and it broadly agreed three things. First of all, the development of contingency interoperability to identify and close interoperability gaps, with the priority lying with achieving interoperability at 4 levels. So a UK brigade in a US division, a US brigade combat team in a UK division, a UK division in a US corps, and a US division in the UK-led NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. The second strand to this relationship was security cooperation, and where feasible, we were to work to harmonise defence security cooperation strategies by deconflicting, synchronising and maximising efforts to build relationships and third-party capacity. Now, we as 16 Brigade and the 82nd Airborne are not engaged in that, but interestingly, 16 Brigade is engaged alongside the United States Marine Corps in the development of indigenous capability in Jordan. The third strand to this vision statement was engagement, so deepening and sustaining our bilateral engagement by maintaining high-level contacts, exchange and liaison programs, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, and unit affiliations. And then on the French side, on the right-hand side of the slide, we have the 2010 Lancaster House Treaty, a bilateral treaty, nothing to do with the EU, which committed the UK and France to build a long-term and mutually beneficial partnership in defence and security, and to make our forces more interoperable. And all of that would allow us to maximise capability by drawing on each other's relative strengths and respective investments in order to help provide our armed forces with the best possible support. And it also allows us, I think, to secure value for money, potentially, by developing capability together, drawing lessons perhaps from good and bad from things like the A400M programme. And then thirdly, with the French, the third strand with the French was to deliver on operations. Military cooperation being a cornerstone of the strategic relationship between the UK and France. And all of that exemplified by the bilateral commitment to the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force. And the very high readiness component of the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force was tagged as the interim CJEF. Interim because airborne forces could start to deliver on the requirement of Lancaster House very quickly. So what to all of that? Well, the so what is the work that I'm about to describe to you is being taken forward in the context of clear bilateral commitments and broadly a shared view of the world's problems and the likely challenges that we may need to face alongside our US or our French allies. So what have we done then to try and bring some substance to what we have been directed to do? So we've regularly exercised together with the 82nd Airborne and with 11 Parachute Brigade in both command post exercises, conceptual training and field training exercises. And again, looking at the Americans, first of all, in terms of developing the global response force for the 82nd Airborne, the highlights have been starting really with the very tactical up to the more operational level achievements. First of all, in Kenya, on the UK sort of capstone light forces CT4 level exercise, we have brought with us elements of the 82nd Airborne to Kenya, and they have trained very successfully embedded at the very lowest tactical level in a UK battle group. We've done this once with 3 para already. We will do it again this year with 2 para. And it is very tactical. But the challenges that one faces in moving third-party ammunition from one country to another, securing diplomatic clearances to move third-party soldiers from one country through a number of others to a final destination, and the whole business of ammunition sharing, of sharing blood and plasma. All of these challenges, exercised at a very tactical level, have allowed us to learn really significant and useful lessons should we need to do this at greater scale in the future. And then if we look at the greater scale of effort, last year we successfully embedded 3 para battle group into a US brigade combat team in the 82nd Airborne, and we have this year built on that and indeed have moved 12 months faster than we anticipated that we would in embedding a UK brigade, 16 Air Assault Brigade, into the 82nd Airborne. And interestingly, it in effect was the UK's Air Assault Task Force that we embedded, incorporating the Joint Helicopter Force with its lift, find and attack aviation capabilities, in addition to elements such as Portuguese Pathfinders, and alongside 6th Polish Airborne Brigade, all as integral components of the 82nd Airborne, and also mounting for a joint forcible entry into Poland from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Ramstein and Warsaw simultaneously. And then in terms of the relationship with the French, and you'll notice the change of title. So we have moved from the Interim Combined Joint Expeditionary Force to the Airborne Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, simply because this capability is no longer interim, and Airborne describes better what it does. And we've conducted with the French a series of exercises over a number of years, and you saw on the screen exercise Pegasus Amarante, but also Swift Response. They were both major milestones in the development of UK and French airborne capability. Pegasus Amarante last year took place across a number of locations in the UK. It tested the ability of the airborne CJEF under 16 Air Assault Brigade command in that instance to deploy, fight, sustain and recover a bilateral brigade in an intervention and stabilisation operation. And then on Swift Response, in the second phase, when we come out of Poland and moved to Germany, the French took command of the airborne CJEF alongside the 1st of the 82nd, conducted a further FTX in Germany with UK and French parachute capability, aviation, air transport, all operating again under the 82nd. And in many ways, this phase of the exercise marked a really significant high point of our interoperability work, because we had moved from a bilateral capability either with the French or with the United States to a trilateral capability where the UK, French and the British were working alongside each other. So I think in sum, as far as this part is concerned, we've made considerable progress towards genuine interoperability with our French and US counterparts, including on the US side, as I say, achieving the milestone of a UK brigade operating in a US division. And with the French, I think progress is perhaps summed up with an example. So again, last year on Pegasus Amarante, we conducted a brigade level manoeuvre, a brigade deliberate night attack with a French battle group with a Gurkha subunit under its command, conducting a forward passage of lines through 2 para battle group at night in an urban area. And at the same time, a UK fire support team commander was controlling French live 120mm mortar fires and UK fast air from an airborne control platform, which was a French Gazelle helicopter. So really significant integration. And of course, I need to also point out, noting, not because there is light blue on the audience, but because it's a fact, that this is not just an endeavour between armies, it's very much an endeavour between our air forces. In terms of capability enhancement then, and this is still in the Fight Tonight space, we are working, we're not resting on our laurels, we're working to enhance capability through a number of initiatives. On the human level, the whole business of cross-training and integration continues apace. It works particularly well in our specialist areas, so the integration of fires, engineers, communications, medical and broader logistics capability, delivered mainly by my units and by their corresponding commanding officers in the 82nd and in 11 Parachute Brigade. We've also reviewed and reinvigorated our liaison and exchange programs. And earlier this year we did have 9 personnel from the 82nd with 16 Brigade and vice versa, 16 Brigade personnel with the 82nd, really focusing on interoperability issues ahead of Swift Response and Anaconda. And beyond this, we're looking to establish a more routine drumbeat of exchanges of NCOs and officers. We've invested much in conceptual training, and we're helped here by the 82nd Airborne's lead and by their initiative to establish an Airborne Commanders Conference. And there have been 3 of those over the past 3 years: London 2014, Berlin last year, and Krakow early last month. And they're a tremendous opportunity for airborne commanders to get together and try to thrash out how we might take this capability forward. We've also conducted extensive trials and development to allow UK, US and French personnel to work together at the tactical level, including jumping, but perhaps more particularly dispatching equipment from each other's aircraft. We most recently achieved some of this through exercise Pegasus International at Bryce Norton, where the UK hosted 100-odd paratroopers from other nations, and we provided parachute training for those troops. But as I say, the more tricky area is the aerial delivery of equipment from each other's aircraft. And the RAF Joint Air Dispatch Trials and Evaluation Unit and the US Airborne and Special Operations Test Directorate work very closely to enable the air dispatch of UK equipment using US platforms. And we have tested 10 UK equipment types on US Type 5 platforms to provide us with essential command and control, offensive support, airfield damage repair and logistics support capability, so that the UK element of the GRF is properly enabled. And it was proved on swift response, where we dropped a UK 105 light gun capability and then fired it live on the exercise. And our focus in the rest of 2016 and beyond is to try to get the French relationship up to a similar level to that which we have with the Americans. In terms of Fight Tomorrow, there's probably a lot of really impenetrable acronyms on this slide. It only serves, I hope, to highlight and point out that there is a plan, and it is not, I assure you, well, you have to take my word for it, it is not a PowerPoint slide deep. What we are trying to achieve in all of this is to press on and deliver more from both of the bilateral relationships, to include the delivery of command and control elements of the full UK Air Assault Task Force, its rotary and fixed wing components in the form of the Joint Helicopter Force. But then, perhaps less tangible but no less important, is the better integration of influence, activity, and also the domination of the information space. There is plenty more business for us to do. And this slide shows just the UK-US interoperability roadmap. It is illustrative, as I say. We have a similar program in place with 11 Parachute Brigade. In terms of broader challenges, there are a number of challenges, and I'm pushing to the end now. Of course, we face the same broad interoperability hurdles that our wider armies face in terms of integrating J6 systems, J4 systems, sharing fuel and ammunition natures, medical protocols, etc. But I have to say, we as airborne forces in our 3 countries are at the spear point of resolving many of those challenges for the broader army and perhaps the heavier armies that follow behind us. But there are technical interoperability challenges that are specific to airborne forces. So the UK, France and the US all use different parachute and container systems. They have different methods of dropping heavy equipment, and we have different aircraft in our air forces. And even where we have the same aircraft, such as C-17 for example, we use them in different ways for different things. Now we have a developed program to try to certify each other's equipment dispatch from each other's aircraft, as I've said, but this takes time and resource, and if I'm honest, it can be a little bit episodic. We perhaps need to make it a more routine and programmed endeavour. And also in part due to the differences in equipment, but perhaps also more particularly because of how our airborne forces have developed in their structures since the Second World War. There are also different risk thresholds and misalignment, and a misalignment of who can own the risk for parachute operations. How do we fix these challenges? Well, there's certainly work to be done on sensible adjustments of our risk protocols based on the requirements of the bilateral relationship. I think there's also a place for the reinvigoration of NATO STANAGs to drive national capability development in a similar or at least complementary direction. But where there are challenges, there are opportunities, significant opportunities for efficiencies and cost saving by drawing on each other's expertise and resources, as long as one recognises what the irreducible minimum of your own national capability is. Our capabilities are complementary as they stand today. So, for example, in the airborne CJEF, 11 Parachute Brigade brings significant infantry airborne mass, greater airborne mass than probably 16 Air Assault Brigade can deliver today. But the UK AATF brings the Joint Helicopter Force, and it also brings really compelling second-line logistics, medical, maintenance and intelligence support that is not readily found in any other nation's airborne quiver. And swift response demonstrated, I think, the economies of scale offered by our bilateral and our multilateral arrangements, both in terms of mass, but also in terms of message. 2 is not twice 1, 2 is 2,000 times 1. And then standardisation, and I listed standardisation as a challenge on the previous slide, but if you get standardisation right, it is absolutely an opportunity. So to conclude, I would offer that 16 Brigade is ideally placed to continue driving on with the interoperability agenda for our nation, alongside the US and the French armies, with the assistance of that really vital joint enabling capability from our air forces. So we'll continue to build a rehearsed, validated and credible binational and potentially a trinational joint theatre entry capability. And in the meantime, I think recent exercises have proven the capabilities of the GRF with 16 Brigade embedded, and the ACJEF with 16 Brigade and 11 Parachute Brigade operating side by side. And we stand ready with those allies, or indeed as a sovereign capability, to fight tonight. If there's a footnote to all of this, I would just reinforce the point that what enables this to be a capability in being are the bilateral agreements that underpin it. Because those bilateral relationships and agreements with the French and with the Americans give us resource leverage as a brigade. And it allows us to get beyond admiring the interoperability problem and doing something about the interoperability problem. And I'll leave it there.
Colin, thanks very much. In a minute we'll go to questions and comments from the floor. Is that on or off the record?
That is off the record.
Off the record, okay. Can I start by...
but you can tell Rich Clark.
Yeah. I was intrigued by your comments about this particular capabilities that 11th Parachute Brigade and the UK Air Assault Task Force bring to the airborne capability. Would you mind saying a couple of words about the particular special capabilities of the 82nd Airborne that complement those over and above their size, which I think everybody knows about?
Yeah. The 82nd Airborne, I think all of, and there's quite a lot of the airborne community in here. I think I think what we're really, consistently impressed by is the 82nd Airborne's consistent and unwavering focus on readiness, and their ability to globally project compelling warfighting force within extremely short notice, much higher readiness than either us or the French, and much greater ability to deliver a compelling capability within those readiness timelines. So that would be the first thing. The mass, you've said it yourself, is the second thing, and then the third thing is the ability to leverage joint enablers on a scale that we really can only dream of. So I think those are the three strands that I think really set the 82nd